books. You have the bios, so I'm not going to go through the bios of the panelists. I will just simply note as they come in who they are. This is the best way so that we can move and get the best time out of wonderful people. So our second panel this morning is on collaboration or catastrophe. And we got the beginning of this with Pedro's question, are we in a trade war? Are we, what's actually happening here? And Louise's contention that we are in a very real trade conflagration. It would be a very good thing to talk about that. Are we into collaboration or catastrophe? So global trends in agriculture for development. We've got wonderful people to discuss this. Dr. Shenggen Fan, hello Shenggen. He has been the Director General of IFPRI for the last 10 years. I know what a good one he's been because I've been sitting on his board watching him. Ambassador Negroponte, who is the ambassador of just about everything to everywhere. He's been, he's had some very tough assignments, particularly Iraq, but also has served in a great number of other places, Mexico, the Philippines, United Nations, etc. And so he's got a very wide perspective on these things. We've got Ismail Serageldin, founder and director emeritus and member of the board of the trustees of Library of Alexandria. It's been going for 2,000 years, not always as active as one would wish since Cleopatra set it up. But when Ismail moved in, it has been a place that has opened and welcomed the world. And Ambassador, there she is, and Ambassador Josette Sheeran, who has been president Sheeran, president and CEO, yes, president and CEO of the Asia Society, but I also think of her in her past role as a very important food executive. So, Josette, forgive me for taking away your N, and I'll put back your food criteria in the bios. So, and as the moderator for this panel may look a little familiar to you, so. Yes, exactly. Ken, take it away, and I will cut you off just as much.
Yes, I know that. That's why I have Maggie, I may call you that, Margaret Catley Carlson there. Thank you so much for doing this. So, yesterday you heard the ambassadors talking about different regions, but the real question is about the global trends. There's so many innovations going on in agriculture, developing the seeds, developing the trade. Heard CEO from agribusiness companies, from reforming the food system. We're going to make it, but in the end, it's about the threats of conflict, about climate change, and how has it all come together? So, having worked in the government for a long time, we always come up with these national intelligence estimates that Ambassador Negroponte oversaw much about what are the trend lines and everything. So I said, I'm going to get 4 of, if not the 4, smartest persons I know about that question, get them all together on the stage for my last ever symposium session and say, come up here and give us the national and the international estimate for the world about what are the global trends. Is it going to be collaboration or is it going to be catastrophe? Ismail Serageldin is the person here on the stage I've been working with. You should just speak, I think, from, if you don't mind, from your seat. Is that okay?
If you say so. You're the boss.
Yeah, I think, yeah. So it meant to be a conversation, if that's...
Okay. That's fair enough.
If it'd be more comfortable if you want to go there.
Yes, I would.
Yeah, please do that.
Because I have also some slides.
Oh, well, I didn't know.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Challenge to cover whatever needs to be covered on the whole planet in 6 minutes. So here we go.
Yeah.
Now, simply stated, as societies develop and the economies grow, people become richer and tend to use more energy per capita. Increased energy has tended to rely on fossil fuels. which correlates with more emissions of greenhouse gases. Scientists have warned us time and again about how the greenhouse gases are affecting the climate and the consequences that climate change will have. So far, renewable energies and nuclear have not been able to take over from fossil fuels at a fast enough rate. We, all of humanity, are now poised at a point in history that defies our collective self-satisfied, placid behavior. We are at the edge of a precipice as our collected decision makers continue to make vague and saccharine promises of decarbonization and removing fossil fuels from the energy mix, but by their actions continue this collective sleepwalking to inevitable catastrophes. The Paris Accord is not being effectively implemented. Last month's climate summit at the UN did not respond to the aspirations of the youth that made the right noises, that politicians made the right noises, but the youth that demonstrated across the planet were not satisfied because they ask if these declarations are just more empty promises. Fundamentally, a milestone in all our scenarios is the goal of zero net emissions by 2050. Now, is that reachable, and what would it take? And citing my friend Václav Smil and the Japanese energy system, we have so far fossil fuels representing 90% of all energy consumption. The first three, oil, natural gas, and coal. Now, biomass, nuclear, other renewables, and hydro account for about 10% collectively. That figure hasn't changed in the last 25 to 30 years. It's been 90% and continues to be 90%. And in fact, the hydrocarbons and the fossil fuels continue to dominate even with new projects factored in. Second point which we need to make is that the delays in bringing about reductions make a very big difference about when and if we are likely to reach a global warming level below 2 degrees. So you see these various curves, and they show if constant emissions for 10 years lead to a required mitigation rate, that would require 30% per year reduction afterwards to catch up. If we had started from the beginning, we would be able to do it with 3% reduction per annum. And that's not happening. Now, on top of that, not only do we have this, the emissions, CO2 emissions, I said that the fossil fuels remained 90%. As the demand for energy grew during these last 25 years, so we are talking about the percentage of a growing set, it grew by 52% over the 25 years. And the emissions grew by 57%, despite all the promises to reduce them. And that's not happening. So, question for us is to say, well, okay, what do we need to have this sudden, the blue breakdown that you see here coming down so dramatically? What is it that will happen that now that after 25 years since we signed the framework agreement and other activities that we've done, IPCC, COP, et cetera, we haven't been able to do anything? That's the top flat line that you see, that's the reality. And then this huge drop is what is needed if we are to stay within 2 degrees, that's the blue. Then between 2 and 2.5 is the green. And then between 2.5 and 3.5 is the red and orange there. And that becomes a major problem. Now, these are the scenarios. We are now converging towards a 3 to 5 degree at best scenarios that we can see. And more importantly, this is really the fundamental summary of everything that I have to say. The black line is what you have in terms of emissions going up, and the red line is the temperature. And there's a temperature target that you see there. And if we assume that today will be an emissions peak, then you suddenly have to have this incredible drop that you see in this graph, that there doesn't seem to be any justification for assuming that next year we will start having a drop of this scale and magnitude. So it is really a serious problem. This scenario assumes that we will have net negative emissions, either by direct air capture and reuse of carbon, or, as I hope to say, that through agriculture and carbon in the soil, as Ratan Lal and others mentioned, planting forests, etc. And what is sad is that the inescapable question we would need here in this scenario, at a minimum 10 to 20% negative taking away of carbon. So far, the best we have achieved is 0.9 of 1%, and that was by Europe and by the US. And what is more important than that, it is partially a lie, because offshoring of production facilities does not reduce the emissions that you're getting, because it's a global climate we're talking about. So, my friends, people are already suffering and dying. And the world of 4 to 5 degrees will bring disastrous misery on many of the poorest and most vulnerable people, and the rich will have to cope with forced migration of environmental refugees, and major adaptation efforts to reduce the risks of disaster must be undertaken in parallel with significantly expanded efforts of reducing emissions. And we need real action at the national as well as the international level. We need regulatory structures. We need ways to control carbon in the industry. We need incentives for innovations in all aspects. But are there solutions to make it possible to stay still under or towards the 2 degrees? Agriculture remains the most promising sector. It has forests, soils, more adapted plants, reduced feed, and precision agriculture is right around the corner. And all this requires global collaborative efforts to avoid the catastrophe. Indeed, perhaps we should also start studying collaboration on considering some geoengineering projects. The contrast between the slow pace of action and the urgency of the problem was underscored by the powerful denunciation of teenager Greta Thunberg, who rightly saw the moment as a critical one to move beyond words to deeds, and warning that if we did not do this, future generations would never forgive us. So let us clearly face the challenge, seek solutions that suit the magnitude of the task ahead, and in the words of the immortal bard, there is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune, omitted all the voyage of their lives, is bound in shallows and in miseries. And on such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves or lose our ventures. But we shall not lose our ventures. The spirit of Borlaug will rise to the challenge. We shall bend the curves to our will, and it can be done, it must be done, and it will be done. Thank you.
Thank you. Ismail, thank you. Yes, keep this. Thank you. So, that's a discouraging way to, with the slides, to start this, but thank you for your candor. John Negroponte, Ambassador John Negroponte, my very, very good friend from the American State Department and Foreign Service, has been looking at trends and as National Director of Intelligence in the United States and served around the world. What's your take on the trends and collaboration or catastrophe?
All right, so the short answer is we can't be sure. And I would give you as the example the current state of United States-China relations. And I depart from the assumption that if the two biggest economies in the world can find a way to collaborate, it's going to be much easier to address the problems of the globe. We have some examples of where we have collaborated with China. In fact, one of them was with regard to the Paris climate agreement, but the agreement between Xi Jinping and President Obama, but that's been overturned since that time. So it seems to me we're at some sort of a fork in the road. I don't know when it's going to be taken or when that's going to devolve completely, but right now there's the risk, and you see it in Washington, of the decoupling of the two economies, of China and the United States. And if we move into some sort of a Cold War scientific and technological confrontation between the United States and China, I think it's going to make it much more difficult to cooperate with each other on global issues. And that not only bodes well for the bilateral relation between us, but I think for the ability of the world as a whole to address these problems. I say we don't know because a lot hinges, for example, on the state of the current trade talks between China and the United States. And are we going to have a sort of a positive break in that situation? Is there going to be some constructive step taken forward? It seems to me that if we could begin to resolve some of the trade issues with China, then that would improve the atmosphere for the overall relationship. So just to highlight the importance of this one bilateral governmental relationship to the future of some of these issues. If I could just make a couple of other points, Ken. We talked some during our meeting of the last couple of days about poor governance as an important contributing factor to many of the problems that we confront. But I think it needs to be highlighted and emphasized because it's where you see poor governance, insecurity, and eventually war in various places, state failure. That's where we run into the most serious problems of environmental degradation, the collapse of agricultural capabilities, the dependence on assistance from the international community with imported foods and so forth. So whatever happens to U.S.-China relations in the next generation, one of the very, very important aspects of all of this is going to be how successful can we be in addressing the issue of state failure, governmental inadequacy, and so forth, at a time of increasing stresses on the political systems of these relatively weaker countries. I would just cite one or two examples of past famines, for example. 1958 to 1961, there was a major famine in China. I was a vice consul in Hong Kong in 1961, and I remember because things were so transparent, so obscure as to what was going on in China, we had a difficult time figuring out what was going on. We had to read the newspapers, interview refugees, but you couldn't get a really good open assessment of what was happening. And somewhere between 15 and 45 million people died during this famine, depending on whose estimates you give credence to. And Amartya Sen, the economist, famous economist, said, "No major famine has ever occurred in a country that was a democracy." And one of the real problems of 1958-61 was that there was no transparency. There was no ability of the citizenry to make its views known, to get the word out about what was happening. So governance, insecurity, these are things that are going to be with us for a long time to come. And the better we can deal with these problems, the better off I think the world is going to be as far as agricultural, the adequacy of agricultural production and our ability to deal with various problems. Two other points. Policies are extremely important. Subsidies. Shenfeng told me the other day that there's $750 billion of agricultural subsidies around the world that distort markets and affect, sometimes in very adverse ways, the choices that are made in various economies about how to deal with their issues. You can see it with respect to, for example, policies designed to favor urban consumers versus the agricultural producers in the countryside. But then at the same time, there's the great dilemma, the great IMF problem. The minute you try to avoid the discipline that's imposed by the IMF and the sort of Washington consensus on how you run your economic policies. Let's say you lift the subsidies for bread in Egypt, you inevitably get a riot and governments rise and fall on these questions. So then that compounds the problem of governmental failure and so forth. Lastly, on environment and climate change, and this to me is perhaps the most important message, Ken. When I was in the State Department and ran the Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs, my deputy, Richard Benedict, negotiated on behalf of the United States for the Montreal Convention for the Protection of the Stratospheric Ozone Layer. And that was in 1987. Sad to say that in the ensuing, whatever that is, 32 years, we've not negotiated another convention or treaty with respect to greenhouse gases. Now, that's just too long. There's no excuse for it. And I'm sad to say that the very bureau that I led for a couple of years in the State Department has not had an assistant secretary during the entirety of this Trump administration. They've just chosen not to fill the job. And they're not even allowed to use the word climate change in a lot of the literature that they put out about the kind of work they do. So to me, that's just that's an American problem. It's not a global trend, Ken. But it just brings home to me the critical importance that we've got to rededicate ourselves to a proactive environmental policy in the United States government. And I think until that happens, I think we're going to be losing opportunities to help avert some of the problems that Ismail described for us before. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Ambassador Josette Sheeran has flown all night, getting in late last night just to be here. I'm so indebted to her. She's such a wonderful friend. I've known her as Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs, as the Executive Director of the World Food Program, and now as the President and the CEO of the Asia Society. And her insights and observations in all three jobs have been so incredible. Thank you for being with us. I'm so looking forward to hearing your views on these global trends.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Quinn. In fact, I'm in between two board meetings and did fly all night, and we'll get on a plane right after the session. But I came here for Ambassador Quinn. This man was the most trusted right hand to my inspiration in life, Norman Borlaug, the man who's driven my career and the things I care about and what I have passion about. And what you've done here is not only elevate food scientists and food innovators to the level, and food policymakers to the level of Nobel Prize, but give us all a refuge, a place to come when we're losing hope on these issues. I'm going to not be too optimistic here, because I don't think we really can rest on any laurels as far as food and access to food in particular, which is my cause in life. So I want to focus on that. Because again, we're in a world where there's enough kilocalories for all humans, and yet we have 100 million people acutely hungry. But more importantly, last year we were on the verge of another food crisis. If the oil prices shot up, like in 2008, to $150 a barrel, or there was another complicating factor, the droughts that swept Europe, the droughts that hit Argentina and Australia, the floods that hit the US, we could have seen us tipping into another world food crisis. I was head of the World Food Program in 2007, 2008, and I quoted the first interview I gave. The economist asked me, "What do you fear?" I said, "The perfect storm." Food stocks are dwindling, and we see energy prices rising, and we see financial crisis brewing. What if this leads to a food crisis? And we saw over the next 6 months food prices double. But what struck me during that time is WFP was being called by heads of state for whole countries that could not get access to food. Not access to humanitarian food, access to basic food supplies on the food shelves, such as Afghanistan, Liberia, the Philippines, we remember, couldn't place an order for rice. So let's look at what's happened since then. In 2011, at the G20, there was an agreement that countries, including with China and everyone, to not put export controls on humanitarian food. So at least maybe there'd be a bit of a tripwire between total disaster. And OCHA and WFP started a food stock monitoring system online, a dynamic system. Basically, though, the systems have not advanced to ensure that we have a backup. All of you have computers, right? We have backup systems. We care about that. Nothing is more vital than human access to food to global stability. Nothing. Food and water. Without access to food, we face what we're seeing in many places in the world, which is conflict and war and refugees. And you look at 2014, 3 days before the flood of Syrian refugees started toward Europe, WFP put out a press release saying they were only funded at 16% for the food for the refugees. It is historic fact that if refugees hear that food will not be coming, they will move. They will risk their lives and move. So all of these stability systems that ensure we don't enter a true food crisis or cause mass movements of people, we haven't done anything, or we haven't done enough, and in some ways we're moving backwards. And so I'd like to call for a few radical ideas here. First of all, US and China do need to get along and prove to humanity that the two most powerful countries can work together to do a few things. Top of my list is figure out a global food security system. China today, in 2008, it didn't have enough stocks. Today, it has half the world's food stocks. That means the remaining stocks are very tight. But China and India, excuse me, need to be able to feed their own populations. I get very excited about this. But if the US and China put their mind to assuring humanity there was a backup plan in a crisis, and I'd put India in there, very important. This could really send a signal that we can work together to do big things. And on my list also is to end polio in the world. We're down to the last cases. China and the US could work together. Secondly, we know how to help stem and manage the movement of people. We don't need situations like Syria, these human crises. So I'm going to call for a global refugee fund where every nation put in its proportion, 1% of what it's putting into other budgets, and be able to stably supply food and shelter and water. And we can stabilize the movement of people. It cannot be that a begging bowl goes out every time we see a mass movement of people. This is in every country's interest, and we need a stable drawdown fund to be able to do that. And the last thing I would say is we need to go beyond the agreement that in a food crisis, humanitarian stocks can move. Every country in the G20 signed that, to a broader global agreement that when export controls are put on, that we can somehow address the countries that have no backup plan, that don't even have 2 weeks of food supply. And even the best of countries have about 28 days. So we need a management system because we are on the edge of these crises between climate, between conflicts, and all that we're seeing. The last idea I have is that we start a World Food Prize to honor those who are innovating. Oops, you already did that, Ken. So we can take that off the list. But we need to recognize and honor the scientists and the technologists and the innovators who are helping solve this problem, make sure they're coming front and center to the world, because that is what drives civilizations and world peace. And so that's the heart of the matter.
Wow. Josette, thank you. Oh my God. So you see why I invited her to be here. Oh my heavens. And that's terrific. And we need nominations of those individuals. So the World Food Prize, which honored the World Food Program in 2003, we need to keep doing that. And we need to honor people who are doing. Catherine Bertini is here, yes.
Probably very correct.
Yes, and so now I turn to Dr. Shenggen Pan, the Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute. member of our Council of Advisors, as is Ismail Serageldin. You see, I find the smartest people are like Louise Fresco and Gordon Conway, and I don't mean, I'm not going to say all the names, but they're all that way. And I get the smartest people in the world to come and be on our council. Dr. Shenggen Fan, great friend, amazing insights, and a broad visionary thinker.
Thank you, Ken. And I could be even smarter because I was undernourished. I was one of your 800 million probably 40 years ago. So the last thing I wanted to see is a conflict or with the trade, with the political conflict between China and the US. I grew up in China until 21. Then I came to this country. I spent 35 years in this country.
Wow.
Now I'm returning back to China. So you can see, I'm torn if there is a war, if there's a conflict. So I think China and the US must work together. But we also must bring others into this global community to work together. Yes. Number one is, you see, the US investment in agriculture, in international aid, benefits these poor people, hungry people. Even here in America, they also benefit from that investment. Just Tuesday afternoon, we launched a report together with the Administrator Mark Green on the impact of international aid, US international aid, on the United States. So farmers benefit from technologies, from CGIAR, from other national agricultural research systems. The agribusiness benefit by exporting more food and agriculture into other countries because other countries, because of your aid, they grow faster. They import more. So just for your information, every $1 exported in the agriculture sector in this country will generate $1.8 in your agribusiness activities. And every $1 billion exports in food and agriculture in this country generates 8,000 jobs. We need jobs, stable jobs, full-time jobs, good jobs. So we must work together. So more aid from these countries, and I think emerging economies like China, they got to offer more to support other countries, Africa and South Asia. So that's number one point I wanted to make. Number two, trade. Yes, absolutely. We must make sure that trade continue to work. Trade helps us to have access to all kinds of foods. This morning we have beautiful breakfast, and lots of actually foods are from other countries. So exports help, or trade help to improve the diversity of what you eat, improve your health and the nutrition, and so on. The trade, we said, generated jobs and so on. Now, my third point is science. Yesterday, Bill Gates, in Bill Gates' video message, he said CGIAR needs $2 billion. $2 billion. I very much agree, to double the current budget. Yes, when Norman Borlaug worked for CGIAR, we worked on wheat, maize, wheat, maize, rice, all the stable foods. Great. We help millions of people out of hunger. But today, I think I must say that in addition to the climate crisis, we have a nutrition crisis. We still have 2 billion people who do not have access to enough micronutrients. Obviously, 2 billion people suffer from overweight, obesity. I think it's a crisis in addition to the climate crisis. How can we really reshape our food system by bringing science and technology to offer some of the solutions both Josette and Ismail mentioned? So, yes, we need money, but I think we must change ourselves to move towards the new food system that can address climate crisis, food and nutrition crisis, and many other challenges. Now, John mentioned policy. Yes, I very much agree. Policy is essential. I heard that, yes, we have lots of technologies and lots of innovations. Ismail, you said we can do it, but why we have not done it? It's a policy. It's a policy issue. John also mentioned a big number, $700 billion question. All these subsidies, $700 billion subsidies, usually the water subsidy, fertilizer subsidy, electricity subsidy, huge waste. So economically, it's inefficient. Then in terms of the environment, in terms of climate change, it emits huge amount of carbons into the air. The fertilizers actually emits a lot of nitrogen into the air. And they always don't produce healthy, nutritious foods. Most of these subsidies are for rice, wheat, and maize. So CGIAR only needs $2 billion. Now we are wasting 700 billion. Actually, not just waste. Actually, they do more harm. So can we reform that? Let's change that. Now, finally, I think the capacity part, why we have not been able to move certain technologies to farmers or even knowledge to our consumers, I think it's a capacity. The global community now very much focus on, some of the big issues, but how can we build the capacities of the recipient countries, of the developing countries, not just the government officials, but also the extension agencies, communities where you have worked before, in Cambodia and Vietnam and so on. So my final message is, yes, despite all this crisis, I'm very optimistic. 40 years ago, I was hungry, I was undernourished. My whole village were part of 800 million statistics, but they are out of that statistic now. I'm very confident if we all work together, global governance, China, US, maybe even India, Europeans together, fix a policy, I think we can do it.
Yes.
We can really remove all the statistics to zero. Thank you.
Yes. Wow. That's it. So I made my first visit to China in 1979, accompanying Governor Ray of Iowa. And China was at about 70% of the population was at poverty level.
90%.
90%.
Under $1, yes.
Poverty level. Now it's 5%.
More than less than 2%.
Less than 2%. I was going to say heading to zero, 2% in 40 years. That is, as I say, often the most incredible transformation of any country, any place on our planet in the last 40 or 50 years, and maybe the world record for transformation. And when I go to China, I see that in comparison between 79 and now. In the issues about how, John, that you brought, how to rise above the potential for significant degradation of the relationship, I think doesn't really necessarily reside in Washington or Beijing, but maybe in Des Moines, because of the unique experience of how the president of China, President Xi Jinping, as a 31-year-old party secretary from an obscure county, Shenggen, in Hebei province, came to Iowa because Iowa and Hebei were sister states, and spent time here and went to Muscatine and stayed in the home of people there, including Serageldin, who was here last night and with us, and came back as vice president to the US-China high-level agricultural symposium that the World Food Prize hosted at our Hall of Laureates. And this was, he had a state dinner in the night before in the Capitol, hosted by Governor Branstad, now Ambassador Branstad. And President Xi Jinping got up to give a toast, most incredible toast I've ever heard by a head of state about another country. And he quoted Mark Twain and talked about his memories of seeing the sun over the Mississippi River and how it was such a part of him. So when he came to our building the next day, and I went to the car to escort him in, he had the Chinese foreign minister and minister of ag with him. Here's Secretary Vilsack and Governor Locke from our ambassador to China, and Governor Branstad. And we're walking in, and I said, Mr. Vice President, I'm so impressed with your experience. I'm going to commission a painting to put in my building about your experiences in Iowa. And he said, through the interpreter, he said, thank you very much. And I said, and I shook your hand to welcome you. I'm one of the few people who shook your father's hand when your father, then the governor of Guangdong, came to Iowa in 1980, right after we established diplomatic relations. And with all respect, I say, President Xi Jinping literally stopped in his tracks, and his eyes got big, and he got a big smile, and he said, "You have two interesting stories." So here is this legacy in Iowa of this China-America connection that's felt intensely by the President of China. And I was at the Asia Society a few weeks ago for the China Daily's China Vision. And I said, I want to make our building, the Hall of Laureates, available for a meeting between China and the United States. We'll keep dealing with the trade issues, but we need to start the process of China and the United States forming this collaborative partnership to ensure that we are able to sustainably and nutritiously feed the 9 to 10 billion people who will be on our planet in just 25 or 30 more years. And having those two countries, and I said, we can bring in India and others, and we can be inspired by Norman Borlaug, Yun Longping, perhaps the most brilliant plant scientist alive today, 90 years old. Everybody in China knows his name, and he's a 2004 World Food Prize laureate, and M.S. Swaminathan of India, the first World Food Prize laureate. With their inspiration, the collaboration of our countries, that we have to. So Josette, we can partner in doing this. We can have the Asia Society come and host in our building and do this together, and maybe IFPRI.
Invite me, yes.
Yes.
Done. We've given birth. I just wanted to make one more reinforcing point to what you were saying. And Valerie Guarneri is here, who runs all the policy and procedures at WFP, but China was WFP's biggest recipient in the 90s. And today, China is a donor to efforts to end hunger. So that switch from that dependency to being able to feed its own population, a fifth of the world's population, and India too, which again, Norman Borlaug so inspired those. We have to understand that's about global stability, because without that capacity, that I also think China and the US could have it out once and for all, and would like to also propose we have a barbecue cook-off between the barbecue specialists in China, who are so proud, and US barbecuers, and we have it here in Iowa.
Yes.
And see who wins.
Absolutely. And because the foreign policy reform in China was led by Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping's father, and that produced this incredible turnaround.
I don't want to be the skunk at
Yes,
the party.
good.
But, and I laud and applaud, no, but seriously, I honestly, I support all these, what I would call basically people-to-people efforts, and they're indispensable. And we should continue, and we should do our darndest to accomplish them, and they're all extremely important. But if you have an atmosphere in the policy-making center of this country, which is Washington, D.C., which says we're going to start examining every scientific cooperation agreement between China, a Chinese university, and an American one, and that you're not going to be able to work on certain areas like information technology, and you're going to... My brother's a professor at MIT. He had one of his programs with a Chinese company. They said you can't have them as a sponsor anymore. If we move down that path, the things you were describing are just going to be that much harder. That's all I'm saying.
Yes. No, you're absolutely right. And right to raise that.
We got to overcome that. We got to
overcome that. And it will.
John, what do we do? We've moved from, if we remember in the 1980s in the US, President Reagan said, trust but verify. And this kind of opened a new era of, if we pin down these agreements, I think we're in the era now of never trust and always verify. The problem with that.
It's indiscriminate.
Yes. Never trust is the starting point, which gets to your point about collaboration. How do you have a world of collaboration or even trade when it's never trust and always verify? And it's led to a very different And I don't think it's just in the US anymore. I think it's really spread, around the globe to a very, protective nationalistic approach to issues and hunkering down of each nation taking care of itself.
But that's why I make the argument that if you can achieve at least some limited progress on some of these trade issues, it might be a confidence-building thing on the one hand, and secondly, it might buy you a little space and time to address these other issues. That's my point.
Ismail?
Yeah, I would just want to add, of course, these are all wonderful proposals, and there is a very important part for people-to-people initiatives. But I agree with John that fundamentally, at the end of the day, it's the center where the decision-making is made for the nation that has to adopt a different perspective in terms of collaborating with others. The catastrophe we're talking about is terrible. And one of the things I said, and I hope people noticed, is there has been a lot of cheating even in Europe, where there was offshoring of production facilities, so that the country could report a reduction in its emissions, but in effect, this is a global issue, so the climate doesn't care about where the political boundary comes from. So we do need a global response, and that will not come about unless the leaders of the planet today, the primary leaders, and that's China and the United States and Europe, and closely followed by India and Latin America, these countries don't come together and start saying, okay, we really need to address this. The charts and the graphs I've shown have been shared since last December in Poland by the IPCC, and we are converging on 3 to 5 degrees. Now, we're not even at 2 degrees or not even 1.5 degrees. And look at the hurricanes, look at the forest fires, look at the droughts, the heat days that we are having.
The worst is if you've been to the Arctic and the Antarctic,
Yes.
as I have, and you watch these huge chunks of ice falling into the ocean. Sure.
Because the actual effect of the heating is much more accentuated on the Arctic than it is in the temperate and tropic zone. So all of this is a global picture, and it needs global collaboration. And thus we have to get over, as John said, we have to get over these hostility or this hostile attitude of never trust and start saying, how can we work together? Because it's all our children that are going to be affected by these erratic rainfalls, cycles of drought and flood, and increased heat and increased storms. And why? We have tools that need to get in, and that requires the support of the governments concerned right across the planet.
But here, Ken, I wanted to emphasize the importance of data and evidence. Yes, we are together, we can hug, we learn how to hug, we can kiss, I learned from Dutch. But I think to really influence policy making or politics, you need data evidence to empower the citizens. They have voting power. You have a democratic system. So data evidence is very critical. That's problem one. Now, I have a couple of former colleagues and friends try to work something on WTO, because WTO basically is almost broken. Everybody benefits from that mechanisms. Yes, it needs to improve, and lots of room to work around, but to just abolish it, it will be a disaster for the whole global trade system. So I think how can we work together as a citizen to bring the data evidence to influence our policy making, policymakers or politicians. We just cannot walk by yourself. It means that you are going to walk alone, and it's not going to walk very far. So data evidence is very critical. I mean, Ismail, you presented some of the data, some of the evidence. It's very shocking. I think we needed to have more like that.
And Ken, I think this issue of food and food supply, it's really linked to a historic shift here, the post-World War II era, where the U.S. really came out and drove and put money behind an era of global cooperation and open sea lanes and open trade. And the US now saying, some, all, the leadership, we're tired, we're not going to do this anymore, we're not going to be the engine. And the world has to step up and buy into it. I don't know how many of you have read Yuval Harari's book, Sapiens. I really recommend it, but it can be a little depressing because as a species, we're very tribal, right? And we innovate on behalf of our tribe. It's not the natural human instinct to come together and cooperate to benefit all the tribes. And so I think in a way after World War II, we've seen the potential to literally end hunger, end child stunting, to end health challenges in the world if we cooperate. And yet we may go backwards, right? We may again need to learn the lesson of what the lack of cooperation and trust can lead to. And so to bend the arc of history, we need to bend the arc of human behavior and that natural instinct that seems so deep in us. But can we learn from the post-World War II era that we literally have in our hands a chance for a peaceful and prosperous world? Can we learn from that?
And that one of the key questions I learned as a Foreign Service officer is you analyze societies by to whom people feel they have an obligation. Who do they owe something? And it's different in different societies. Some places it's just your family. Others it's your community. Others it's people of your religion or so. The thing about Norman Borlaug and about Governor Robert Ray of Iowa, who reached out to refugees, or that they both saw an obligation to help people around the world who were suffering, even though they were different from them in every way, who were not part of their tribe. They spoke a different language, came from a different culture, worshiped a different God, had different colored skin, but they were human beings. And that question now will be part of political discussions. To whom does our community, our state, our country, your country feel an obligation? And if it's not, as Norman Borlaug would say, to the 800 million who are still chronically suffering food and hunger, those food insecurity, and that, then it will be a different world. And the question is, well, can you insulate yourself from all the impact of the catastrophes that can come? And I think the answer is that human migration as a species will always go to the food and the water and will produce the chaos. We have only 4 minutes left. I want to give everyone 1 minute for any final thoughts, ideas, insights. John?
One of the things that I would have pushed had I stayed in that bureau that I was talking about of oceans, environment, and science, after we did the Montreal Protocol, I got called off to do another job, unfortunately. But I would have pushed for a global forestry initiative. We've talked some about forests here. Maybe forestry should be one of the items on next year's program.
Borlaug studied forestry at the University of Minnesota.
Anyway, to me, that would make an awful lot of sense. And there's a lot that can be done in that area, both in terms of reforesting the more easily replaceable types of forests, and of course the protection of tropical forests, particularly in the largest producing countries, Brazil, Congo, DRC, and Indonesia. I'm not brimming with optimism about how easy it's going to be to protect what remains of our tropical forests, but I would consider that also a highly urgent task in the field of environmental protection.
Yeah. Ismail.
Well, I would certainly support that, and it was one of the things I mentioned, but just in passing. But it really deserves focus because forests are also one of our primary tools against the carbon emissions. But the other part, which I would hope we would have a global attention to and maybe agreement on, is the oceans. We have ignored the oceans. We've been very rapacious with them, both in terms of pollution and overfishing and everything else. But now we're beginning to learn the science, as Shenggen said, that their enormous impact on the climate, on everything else. And we know so little about the oceans, and yet they are, of course, they cover 3/4 of the planet, and it's the quintessential global public good. The quintessential global public good is the oceans.
Shenggen?
Yeah. I think we must work together. Break the country boundaries. So Ken, you are looking for a job, a new job after this?
I am.
I think one is come to China.
All right.
To make speeches.
All right.
Then we can split the speech fees.
Ah,
Yeah,
yes.
we can,
Oh.
but more seriously, I think that sort of one-to-one individual interactions are so important. You know, they will see you, see your face, see your heart. All this sort of political animosity will be gone. So I truly believe it's one-to-one, people-to-people, get rid of this political ideology, slogans. I think that will save our world.
Wow. Shenggen, thank you for the. I've been to China. I've been to China 4 times this year.
This year.
This year.
Just this year.
Yes. And I doubled the number of Chinese students who are here at our Youth Institute, who were there at breakfast. And I believe there's 350,000 Chinese students at American universities, I believe, so passionate in that. Josette?
I have a 1 minute and 15 seconds.
No, 1 minute. I get the last 15 seconds.
Okay, all right. So first, I just want to put in a vote for our wonderful fish, 45% of the world's protein supply, and my mother's burial site is on an artificial coral reef off the coast of New Jersey, as she would have wanted. We have a deep devotion in our family to our oceans. So forests and oceans, we have to love them and appreciate them. I'm going to put my hope at the end of this panel really with the next generation. How many of you are under 35 here, let's say? Wow, right? So when I was head of the World Food Program, my favorite thing literally was to come to the Iowa State Fair, meet with the 4-H clubs, and then go to the land-grant universities, meet with the scientists whose minds are on fire with how to feed the world and how to build a better planet. So I'm voting for this generation that is globally connected, globally minded, cares about the world, wants to make their hometowns better, but also are putting their minds to finding solutions. So you all are stepping up to the plate, and we all are, I know all of us do mentoring and support, but you're what give me hope, really. And I know that you see a world where these problems will be solved and addressed.
Wasn't this an incredible conversation? Global trends. Thank you so very, very much.
That was one of the most unforgettable panels that you will ever listen to on a complete